thank you everyone for joining us today for our weekly webinar series. Today's topic, we will be tackling managing toxic employees. A little bit about us. We are Achkar Law. We were first founded in 2016. Our focus is on employment law, human rights law, workplace investigations, labor law, and civil litigation. We serve all of Ontario and beyond. Today's webinar series is hosted by yours truly. My name is Charles Miller. I'm a senior associate here with the firm, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Madison Chilvers, who's also a senior associate, will be helping me with today's webinar series. Let's delve right in. First thing to ask yourself about managing toxic employees is, how do I identify them? Well, usually glaringly obvious that you've got a toxic employee. But toxic employees need to be distinguished from difficult employees and bad employees. A toxic employee is somebody who is actually taking proactive steps to undermine the business, undermine their colleagues, management, leadership, hurt the business, and generally lower morale. Toxic employees have characteristics such as constantly complaining. If you've got an employee who complains a lot about their colleagues or about management, they might be toxic, they might be stirring the pot, or they have a legitimate complaint. So do take every complaint that comes across your desk as though it is something that absolutely needs to be investigated. But if you start to notice a particular employee is complaining a lot, chances are they might be the common denominator. Toxic employees also have a very difficult time taking any constructive feedback. You may notice with one or two employees you might have where if you provide feedback, they start pointing fingers. It's not my fault. It's Alyssa's fault, or it's Matthew's fault. They didn't pick up the slack. I did my best. They also finger at supervisors and management. Toxic employees, they can't be bothered to take any responsibility for even legitimate concerns with their behavior. They always point the finger. Toxic employees also tend to undermine others by spreading rumors, and generally speaking, lower the morale of the business altogether. This is different from a difficult employee who actually wants to be good at their job. They generally like what they do. They're not there to undermine, but they might just have a grating personality. They might just be somebody who's just a little annoying. But the good news is that with a difficult employee, chances are with a bit of coaching, you can bring that person around. You can't do that with a toxic employee. Madison's going to go into a lot more detail about how to handle a toxic employee, but at the end of the day, more often than not, you can't really change them. They're going to be a problem from the get-go. Difficult employees can be brought around. They're not actually trying to undermine others. Versus a bad employee, who is usually somebody who's just in a role that's above their skill set. They don't mean to do a bad job. They're not there to cause troubles. It's just not a good fit of a role for them. Bad employees, you can typically give a bit of training to catch them up or determine that they're probably not ultimately a good fit. Toxic employees, though, there's a reason why we use the term toxic. They're poisonous to the environment. They make other people hate working at your company. They make managers unable to effectively lead, and they impact client relationships. Toxic employees can lower the morale such that some of your best sellers or your best performing employees underperform, or they may resign, leading to potential claims against your company, such as constructive dismissal claims or claims for breach of dealing with harassment or bullying in the workplace. The toxic employee may also impact your place such that your leaders, managers, and supervisors can't effectively lead because toxic employees tend to undermine authority in the workplace. Talk about how their boss isn't good or doesn't know anything, shouldn't be trusted, so that other people stop listening to the managers and supervisors you've put in place. Or worse, they stop listening to you so that you're there running your company and you can't get your employee base to do anything or trust in your vision or trust in your accomplishments or intelligence in how the business should run. Toxic employees can essentially just completely take the heels from underneath a wonderful business. Also, toxic employees can impact your sales because toxic employees don't just impact the workplace directly, they impact outside of it. They'll go to friends or family saying why your business is no good. They'll go to clients and even undermine you to clients. And you may see that some of your clients stop paying on time or stop going to you for work. So truly, the impact of a toxic employee is extremely detrimental to a business and to the vision that you may have for your company in terms of the pride you want to take in it. The cultural impact of like the business culture impact of the toxic employee is one aspect. They make it so no one wants to work there. They make it so that it's hard for business to get going. But there's also legal implications for having a toxic employee in the workplace, such that you may find yourself vulnerable or liable to all sorts of damages against your company if you don't excise or deal with a toxic employee effectively. And again, Madison's going to go into great detail about exactly how to do that. Some legislation that deals with a toxic employee is the Ontario Health and Safety Act, affectionately known as OSHA. Part 3, Section 32 details the company's active duty to provide a harassment-free workplace. Also, the Human Rights Code of Ontario, or the Canadian Human Rights Commission, has, and if you fail to do so, then your employees who are victims of these toxic colleagues of theirs may have claims against the company. For instance, if you have an employee who is a good employee, but they're being actively bullied and undermined by the toxic employee, well, then the bullied employee can actually bring a claim forward for constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal claims are similar to wrongful dismissal claims, except rather than saying I was terminated and not paid enough, in terms of a constructive dismissal claim, what they're saying is that the workplace was so toxic, I was bullied, I was harassed, I had to quit. I had to leave. My employer wasn't doing enough. In those claims, the courts will award typically common law reasonable notice, which can be months to years, plus special damages and aggravated and punitive damages for the pain and suffering experienced by the bullied employee. So that if you've got a toxic employee and they make it so that your employees truly hate working there, you could have 2, 3, or dozens of constructive dismissal claims come across your desk. And not only are you gutted without a workforce, but now you have to pay out all these damages because steps weren't taken to protect people. These legal issues are very important in terms of understanding that it's not just the company you take pride in that is poisoned by a toxic employee, but if you as an employer don't take active steps to make sure your employees are safe, you could end up being liable for a lot of legal claims against you. Now, dealing with the toxic employee is also important, because if you don't deal with the toxic employee properly or effectively, or at least cautiously, you could end up with a legal claim by the toxic employee who you already know is vexatious and likely to cause a stir against you. So, to go into details about how to keep your company safe and how to deal with toxic employees in the workplace, my friend and colleague Madison is going to dive into that. Thank you so much, Madison.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm going to preface this with there's no one size fits all for every scenario. I'm just going to go through some basic pillars that we would recommend companies follow. Depending on the situation, we can deal with issues of a toxic employee who's maybe starting rumors up into maybe saying racist comments in the workplace. It varies, and that's going to vary on the company's response. That I'm just going to run through a couple best practices. And if you are in a situation like this, do seek out legal advice so that you can tailor it specifically to that situation. The first and probably most important part is effective communication and documentation. How I would recommend companies prepare for this is having set out policies, employee handbooks, procedures that are written, accessible to employees, ideally given to employees when they first start their employment so they know what standard the company wants to hold them to. Another really good benefit of having policies and procedures in place is when a toxic employee comes in and another employee, say, wants to make a complaint about this, they know the process to follow. A lot of the issues I see arise with employee clients is they don't know the process, they don't feel the company is doing anything for them. So the best thing you can do is set out a roadmap and also the expectations. If those are clearly defined, that's one going to do a lot of the groundwork that you would need to defend yourself in the event maybe you have to terminate a toxic employee, or like I said, if there's these policies and everything in place, it's going to provide you some protection against potential litigation when you're dealing with a toxic employee. Progressive discipline. This is probably one of the best tools companies can use when dealing with a toxic employee. Again, it's not a one size fits all. You do have to vary it depending on the circumstances of the matter. So usually what we recommend is start with a verbal warning to the employee, keep it a little casual at the beginning. If it continues, then we're going to go into a written warning where it's into the employee file. If it persists, you could put them on a performance improvement plan, and I'll discuss more specifics of a performance improvement. If the performance improvement plan is not successful, you could put a final warning, a final written warning to the employee. And from that point forward, if the behavior still isn't fixed or the issues are still not trending up, then you want to do a suspension or potentially look at a termination. Going through these steps are important because it establishes consistency when you're dealing with employees who may use, whether it's a toxic employee or maybe an employee who's struggling with performance. It also creates a fair and consistent way to manage these issues with any kind of employee and specifically toxic employees. So a PIP or a performance improvement plan is a really great tool for companies to use. A lot of companies collaborate with the employee. They'll put together a plan, they'll talk it over, the employee will put some input as well. And usually it sets out specific goals, expectations, and timelines. So a timeline of when you want to start seeing this improvement and what may happen if by the end of that timeline, the improvement isn't seen. Another really great tool companies can have at their disposal is HR departments or legal departments. So having an HR department is really helpful because one, it's a department dedicated to ensuring policies and procedures are up to date. It's also a really great tool for managers to be able to get assistance for dealing with toxic employees. This again relates back to having that effective communication and documentation, the policies in place, the handbooks and managers can refer to. So managers know how to deal with this. Training managers on how to deal with conflict, really good asset for companies to do. It's going to help you because now your managers are going to know how to deal with a toxic employee. And there's a set guideline set out in the policy and the handbooks. Another good thing about HR is they can do training on this. You can do training days with managers, setting that foundation with the handbooks, the policies that every employee knows, every employee has access to, whether they're working in a warehouse all the way to working up in upper management. Just having that there is really going to set a good foundation for the company. And like I said, you can fall back on those policies if litigation or if the company does get sued for constructive dismissal and or if you do in fact have to say terminate the toxic employee. As well as to address these issues is you want to act early, you want to be fair, you want to improve employee performance. So focus on that. You want to try to problem solve and you want to try to maintain a positive work environment. So acting early, again, having those policies in place. You're already acting early. If you have policies and handbooks in place, you have a set system, you have a set code that employees can follow and they know what the expectations are of the company and of them. Being fair. So this again goes back to those policies. If you have fairness and due process, a structured process for addressing employee performance or conduct in the workplace, that's going to create that consistency that I was talking about. Focusing on trying to help the employee improve is key. And the reason this is key is, you're in an employment relationship. It's not just you, it's not just the employee who has the expectation to do everything. You as an employer also have an expectation to create a work environment that's free from harassment and bullying, as well as if there's performance issues with an employee or behavioral issues with an employee, you also have an obligation to correct that before you just jump the gun, which is why progressive discipline is, again, a really good tool to use when dealing with toxic employees. Trying to problem solve. Again, this goes back to progressive discipline. This goes back to having set policies. So if there are problems, you have mechanisms into place to try to solve the issues that may arise. And then if you can do all of this, this will help you maintain a hopefully positive work environment where there's consistency, due process, and fairness. Employees won't feel like they're being targeted separately than other employees because they're all held to the same standards. Terminating a toxic employee. Again, depending on the circumstances and the seriousness of the conduct that's going on, this can vary, but just building off of what we discussed previously, that progressive discipline is really going to help you build a case to why employee maybe should be terminated. Now, there's two ways you can terminate an employee. You can terminate an employee for cause or without cause. The technical term under the Employment Standards Act is with notice or without notice. To determine what may be best for this, I would recommend speaking to a lawyer. Terminating an employee without notice or without pay in lieu of notice is a very serious thing. It's a very high bar you as employers have to meet, willful misconduct, and where we'll actually have the legal facts to support termination without providing notice. Termination with notice is where there's no specific reason. Maybe they're just not a good fit. Maybe you've realized a toxic employee, whether maybe they haven't done anything that's so overtly wrong that we may be able to establish a willful misconduct termination, but they're just not a good fit in the company. They're poisoning the work environment. An option is to terminate them with notice and provide them that notice period pay. Looking at terminating an employee, the first thing you should do is look at their employment contract. Hopefully they have one. If they don't have one, that could open you up to common law reasonable notice. And depending what your contract says, for them just list the minimum, saying employees are only entitled to the minimum. Sometimes employers will include extra benefits upon termination with notice or without cause. So it's always good to reference that and make sure when you're starting to put together the termination letter that it adheres to the terms listed in the employee agreement when they signed it. Next step would be gathering all relevant documentation. If you are terminating an employee for cause or without notice, making sure you have all the documentation needed. You're going to need to walk the employee through the reason why you're terminating them. It's going to have to be listed in the letter and detailed in the letter or the notice of termination. Key thing is when you're terminating an employee, it should always be in writing. Under the Employment Standards Act, the termination actually is not effective until it's in writing. So you can't verbally terminate someone and then 2 weeks later give them a letter. Under the legislation, the termination doesn't become effective until you give them a written notice of that termination, whether it's for cause or without cause. And then preparing for the meeting. It's always recommended that you have at least another manager or manager with human resources at the termination meeting with you. You want to witness. You're going to want, again, walk detrimental to this employee. It's good to be compassionate. Hand them the letter, explain to them why they're being terminated. If it's a termination without cause, you actually don't need them, but you should walk them through their entitlements. You should walk them through the minimum entitlements that they're awarded under the Employment Standards Act, and anything else you may offer them as releases are usually attached to termination letters. The release usually is in consideration of an additional payment to the employee. By the employee signing the release, they are saying they essentially won't sue the company. This whole the letter, preparing for the meeting, again, I would recommend speaking to legal counsel. You don't want to get this wrong. This is where a lot of liability lies. Wrongful claims stem a lot from the letters that are sent out by companies for termination. And good policies, good employment contracts, good handbooks, having that foundation is really going to save you a lot of time and money in the future. It's worth investing in that now. When you're doing this termination letter, always good to just run it by a lawyer. Make sure you're up to date on legal standards. They change all the time. For example, we just got a brand new case that came out and changed how employment agreements need to be drafted. So again, just keeping in touch with a lawyer, having a legal department is really going to help you avoid a lot of issues in the future. Final steps after termination to help with a smooth transition, just to build a little bit more on what I said, maintaining professionalism, confidentiality. You're not going to share why this employee was terminated. You're not going to go into the office and starting rumors against this employee. You have an obligation of good faith and fair dealing, and that does extend past the termination. And so does the employee. You want to make sure you're updating internal records, getting that record of employment out within 5 calendar days. And then finally, you'll want to announce to your employees that this employee has been let go. And again, you don't need to give any reasons, but giving a notice is always nice so employees are up to date about what's going on.
Thank you so much for that, Madison. So we've had a couple questions that were sent in. We still have the Q&A window open as well, so please feel free to send in questions as they come up. But the first question I have for you, Madison, you are in the hot seat. How do I report a toxic coworker, and what if it is actually a manager I need to complain about?
So hopefully you have an HR department. If you don't have an HR department, you may want to report it to the manager above your manager. Always a good idea to report things like this, like a toxic work environment. If you're suffering from anxiety and stress, you want to report it. You want to give the company an opportunity to try to respond to this, because if you sit there silently and then try to claim a constructive dismissal, it makes your constructive dismissal a little harder to claim. Always good to give the company an opportunity to respond to the allegations and investigate them properly.
Thank you for that. Masson, do you mind speaking a little bit more to non-disclosure agreements and where would they apply if someone was fired for cause?
If someone's fired for cause, unless there's an NDA in your employment agreement, depending on the information that you're dealing with, they don't really extend much to post termination. Like you wouldn't get an NDA as part of a termination package unless you already signed one because of the subject matter that you work with while you're working there. And that would extend. You'd have to look at the terms of the NDA. Similar to confidentiality, a lot of contracts have confidentiality clauses. They also have a clause to act in good faith about keeping trade secrets, etc. So all of that would extend past the termination. Termination for cause is, if we're talking about the standard under the Employment Standards Act, is a little tricky. They're probably going to list all the issues they had with you. They're not going to share that. They shouldn't be sharing that with the company at large. If they get a call from a future company about your termination, most of them will just either not comment. So I don't know if that answers questions about NDAs specifically, but I generally don't see them in termination letters.
Absolutely. To build off Mass's point there, sometimes you might see a non-disparagement clause might go into a mutual release where you can't necessarily go around and start talking bad about each other. You might see those. But as Mass said, non-disclosure agreements typically are at the formation of the employment agreement. When can I ever tell employees why you fired the toxic employee? Specifically dealing with the context where you've had likely multiple people come forward to complain about this toxic employee, and you want to demonstrate your good faith as the employer that you've actually taken active steps to create a harassment-free workplace. So when can you, if ever, share details that a toxic employee was fired due to their antics or behavior?
My recommendation is never to use them as a specific example. Obviously, all complaints brought against this employee should be confidential. So you also don't want to breach the confidentiality of the employees who brought forward the complaints. Like I said, when you do terminate a toxic employee, you do want to keep their confidentiality as well as the reason they were terminated. However, if there was a specific incident that happened that was kind of the tipping point, in that case, you could use the circumstance and explain that why that's not acceptable in the workplace and how that applies to your policy. You're not singling out the employee, you're singling out conduct that you're found out that the company finds unacceptable in the workplace. Again, you just want to tread carefully. My recommendation would not be to do that because, again, you also don't want to break the trust of the employees who still work for you and bring forward those complaints. And you want to make sure you're protecting their confidentiality as well.
What do we do in situations where, let's say, an employee has reported another toxic employee, but during the reporting process, the manager they reported to suddenly turned the tables on the whistleblower and basically pointed the finger back at the whistleblower? How can this particular person who's now raised these concerns in the workplace protect themselves, especially if it seems that complaining to HR management doesn't do the trick?
Okay, so this isn't, just so I understand, this is an employee who complained against a manager and now the manager is turning it on the employee.
The employee has complained about another toxic employee to their manager, and the manager seems to have taken the toxic employee's side.
First thing I would look for is hopefully they're going to be doing an investigation into this. If there's a real issue, they should be taking it seriously. Depending on the circumstances, they may want to talk to other employees who may have witnessed this. If you're finding that you went to HR, you went to your manager, they're not doing anything, and now you feel like the tables are being turned on you, this could be a constructive dismissal. This could be a failure to investigate or an improper investigation. I would want some more details, but in short, don't feel like you have nowhere else to go because you might want to seek counsel at this point, because it sounds like you've given the company an opportunity to respond to the issue in a constructive way, and they're not responding to it in a constructive way.
Absolutely. And whenever it comes to a constructive dismissal or toxic situation, there's what the toxic employee did and there's what the company did about the toxic employee. And if you're the employee suffering from both, then we recommend speaking to legal counsel post haste. What should I do if I find out a toxic employee has been bad-mouthing my company to one of our clients? What should I say to the client?
You do an investigation, make sure this is substantiated. I don't know the circumstances surrounding it, but before you address it, I would definitely do an internal investigation, make sure it's substantiated, see what is said. With respects to talking to the client, if the client was the one who brought it to you, and that kind of opens the door easily for you to address the situation. Again, I wouldn't necessarily start bad talking the employee, but I would address what is being said and why that's incorrect. And I would try to take a more constructive route. I would say, these things that are being said are actually not true, and this is why, and this is our company's values and policies, and we're investigating into why this was said. And we like try to build back up your customers' confidence in you. But more on the employment side, I would definitely address this with the employee if this does become substantiated. This is a huge issue. It's a conflict of interest. They're actually breaching a duty they owe to you as a company because now they're trying to sabotage your business depending on their position. If they are higher up, this could be a breach of fiduciary duty. So it might be worthwhile talking to an employment lawyer to address some of these steps and get a little more clarity on what you could do on the employee side as well.
As the employer, can I sue a toxic employee for damage they have caused to my company?
That is a loaded question. And one thing I say it again, depending on how high up they are, obviously, if they're in a director role or senior management role, they owe the company a fiduciary duty. That means they actually have control over the decisions the company's making. So that would create that standing that we'd be looking for a potential breach of contract or breach of fiduciary duty. A lower level employee, I would have to know a little bit more about the circumstances. Generally, it's harder to show just because they don't have control over where money's being spent, etc. If they did actual damage to property, you could sue them for the damages to the property. So if they were driving a forklift and took out a whole section of like your warehouse, that could maybe be something. But again, I need to know a little bit more about the employee and the specifics.
But that is the favorite lawyer response to a lot of questions is it depends. Give me more information. I can tell you more. But absolutely, what Maddie had said, the higher up the chain these toxic employees are, the more damage they can do and the more grounds you have for claim against them. We have a question here that we don't have time to get to is can you re-explain for cause versus no cause, an example for each? Actually, we did just do a webinar series on this very topic. I recommend going to our YouTube channel. You can watch these videos and rewatch them as you desire. We go into great detail about the exact cause, for cause, no cause, wrongful, willful neglect of duty. I highly recommend going into those webinars. You will be able to review everything we talked about in these series.
Yeah, and there's also some really good articles. Go to the blog section of our website. We do talk a lot about for cause and without cause terminations in the blog section of our website.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, you were a pleasure to host. That is our contact information there. If you have any follow-up questions or questions we didn't have time to address, please send us an email or give us a call. We would love to hear from you. We do love what we do here, so please do reach out. And again, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week. Have a wonderful day.
Have a great day, everyone.